I stared at Blake in disbelief as he knelt before me, holding out a sparkling diamond ring. "Harper, will you make me the happiest man alive and marry me?" My heart raced, and I felt a rush of excitement mixed with nervousness. This was all happening so fast, but I couldn't deny the love I felt for him. "Blake, this is so sudden." "Yes, I will." He slipped the ring onto my finger and we embraced, garnering applause from the other patrons of the high-end restaurant. In that moment, everything seemed perfect, like a fairy tale come true. Little did I know, the fairy tale was about to take a dark turn. A few days later, Blake and I were having dinner at his parents' lavish estate, where I would officially meet his family. I had heard stories about their wealth and influence, and I couldn't help but feel a twinge of anxiety. As we sat down at the table, Blake's mother, Carolyn, fixed me with a scrutinizing gaze. "Harper, what's your highest level of education?" I shifted uncomfortably in my seat. I graduated from a community college while my mom raised me alone." Carolyn's eyes narrowed, and she turned to my mother, Jennifer, who had accompanied me. "You raised her alone?" Jennifer nodded, her posture rigid. "Yes, I'm a single mother. I've worked hard to provide for Harper." Carolyn scoffed, and before I could react, she picked up her glass of wine and flung it at Jennifer, drenching her in the deep red liquid. "Mother, what are you doing?" Blake exclaimed, but Carolyn silenced him with a wave of her hand. "This engagement is over," she declared, her voice dripping with contempt. "Harper is not a suitable match for our family." I sat there, frozen in shock, as Carolyn and Blake's father, David, berated us, their words cutting deeper than any knife ever could. As Jennifer and I made our way out, I overheard Blake's voice from another room. "Compared to Harper, Melanie is perfect. Educated, well-connected, it's a no-brainer." My heart shattered into a million pieces, and a burning rage ignited within me. Without thinking, Jennifer and I burst back into the room, startling Blake and his family. "You'll regret this, Blake," I spat, my voice trembling with fury. "I'll make sure of it." Jennifer's eyes burned with determination as she added, "We'll ruin your precious family's company if it's the last thing we do." With those words, we stormed out, leaving behind a stunned silence. The fairy tale had ended, and a new chapter of revenge was about to begin. The next few days were a blur of anger and humiliation. I tried my best to maintain a professional demeanor at work, but every time I saw Blake, a wave of resentment washed over me. "Harper, can we just act professional?" he had the audacity to ask one day as we passed each other in the hallway. I fixed him with a withering glare. "Don't talk to me. Ever." His face fell, but I couldn't bring myself to care. He had shattered my heart, and his family had treated my mother and me like garbage. Meanwhile, Jennifer was on a warpath, determined to bring down the Turners at any cost. "We need everything on them," she told me one evening over the phone. "Financial records, emails, anything that could be used as leverage." I nodded, though she couldn't see me. They'll never see it coming. With a newfound sense of purpose, I started paying closer attention to Blake's behavior at work. I noticed him taking frequent calls in hushed tones, disappearing for hours at a time without explanation. And then there was Melanie, the woman he had chosen over me. She would strut around the office like she owned the place, always throwing me condescending looks whenever our paths crossed. One day, as I was working late, I overheard Melanie on the phone in the break room. "Don't worry, baby. I'll take care of everything. Harper is no threat to us." My blood boiled at the smug tone in her voice. She had no idea what was coming. Over the next few weeks, Jennifer and I meticulously gathered evidence of Blake's misdeeds. Financial statements that didn't add up, emails discussing shady business deals, even recordings of him bad-mouthing his own family. "They're going to pay for what they did to us," Jennifer said, her voice laced with determination. I nodded, my jaw clenched. The Turners had made a grave mistake in underestimating us. Their perfect little world was about to come crashing down around them. With our plan set in motion, Jennifer and I decided to pay one final visit to the Turners' estate under the guise of returning Blake's engagement ring. As we pulled up to the imposing gates, my heart was pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. "Are you ready for this?" Jennifer asked, her expression steely. I took a deep breath and nodded. More than ready. We rang the bell, and a few moments later, the gates swung open, allowing us to proceed up the winding driveway. As we approached the front door, it opened to reveal none other than Melanie, her perfectly coiffed hair and designer outfit a stark contrast to our more modest attire. "Well, well, if it isn't the scorned ex-fiancée and her mom," she sneered, looking us up and down with disdain. Before I could respond, Carolyn's shrill voice echoed from inside. "Who is it, Melanie?" "Just some unwanted guests," Melanie called back, her lips curling into a smug smile. Carolyn appeared in the doorway, her nose turned up in distaste. "What are you doing here?" I held up the ring box, my hand trembling slightly. "I'm here to return the ring," Carolyn scoffed. "Get out of my house." But I stood my ground, feeling a surge of confidence coursing through me. "Not until you hear what I have to say." Melanie rolled her eyes. This should be good. Ignoring her jab, I pulled out my phone and hit play on the damning recordings we had gathered. Blake's voice filled the air, discussing shady business deals and misappropriation of company funds. Carolyn's face drained of color as she listened, her eyes widening in horror. "Blake, what have you done?" As if on cue, Blake himself appeared, his expression turning to one of panic when he saw us. "Harper? Mom, what's going on?" "You tell us, son." David's gruff voice came from behind him. "Care to explain these recordings?" Blake's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no words came out. Melanie, however, found her voice. "Blake, you assured me everything was above board. You lied to me." The tension in the air was palpable as the Turners turned on each other, accusations and insults flying back and forth. In the chaos, Jennifer leaned over and whispered in my ear, "Their empire is crumbling, just as we planned." I allowed myself a small smile, feeling a sense of vindication wash over me. The Turners had brought this upon themselves, and now they were reaping what they had sown. "Good riddance," I muttered, watching as Melanie stormed off, her perfect facade finally shattered. After the explosive confrontation at the Turners' estate, I expected Blake to slink away in shame, tail between his legs. Instead, he had the audacity to show up at the office the next day, acting as if nothing had happened. As I sat at my desk, trying to focus on work, I could feel his eyes boring into the back of my head. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "What do you want, Blake?" I hissed, whirling around to face him. He held up his hands in a placating gesture. "Harper, I know things got heated the other night, but can't we just move past it, for the sake of professionalism?" I let out a humorless laugh. "Professionalism? After everything you and your family put me through?" Blake's expression hardened. "That's ancient history. Melanie and I have moved on, and you should too." My blood boiled at the mention of his new fiancée, the woman he had chosen over me, only for her to turn on him when the truth came out. "Don't you dare say her name in front of me," I spat. "And don't think for a second that this is over. Your family's downfall is just beginning." Blake's eyes flashed with something akin to fear, but he quickly masked it with a smirk. "Whatever helps you sleep at night, Harper." With that, he turned and sauntered away, leaving me seething. The nerve of that man, acting like he was untouchable. Over the next few weeks, Blake continued to pester me, sending me emails and leaving voicemails, all in the name of professionalism. Each time I deleted or ignored them, my hatred for him growing stronger by the day. Meanwhile, Jennifer and I were hard at work, gathering even more evidence of the Turners' misdeeds. Financial records, incriminating emails, you name it. We were building an airtight case against them, one that would ensure their empire crumbled to dust. And then there was Melanie. The woman who had once looked down her nose at me now seemed lost and adrift, her perfect life in tatters. Part of me felt a twinge of satisfaction at seeing her brought low, but mostly I just pitied her. She had been just as much a pawn in Blake's games as I had. As the weeks turned to months, the walls continued to close in on the Turners. Their once mighty company was hemorrhaging money and clients, and rumors of their shady dealings were beginning to circulate in the media. Through it all, I remained focused and professional, letting my work speak for itself. And whenever Blake tried to engage me, I shut him down with a withering glare or a curt "leave me alone." The time for words was over. Now, it was time for action. And Jennifer and I were ready to deliver the final blow that would bring the Turners to their knees. As the weeks passed, my determination to bring down the Turners only grew stronger. Jennifer and I spent countless hours poring over the evidence we'd gathered, looking for any weak spots in their armor. "We need to hit them where it hurts the most," Jennifer said one evening, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Their reputation, their finances, everything." I nodded in agreement. "They'll regret the day they ever crossed us." Meanwhile, at the office, I couldn't help but notice Blake's behavior becoming increasingly erratic. He would disappear for hours at a time, only to return looking disheveled and stressed. I couldn't help but wonder what shady dealings he was up to now. One day, as I was leaving for the evening, I caught sight of Blake in a heated conversation with a man I didn't recognize. Their voices were hushed, but the tension was palpable. "You have to take care of this, Blake," the man hissed. "Your family's reputation is on the line." Blake ran a hand through his hair, his expression one of pure desperation. I know. Just give me a little more time." As they parted ways, Blake caught sight of me and froze, his eyes wide like a deer in headlights. Before he could say anything, I turned on my heel and walked away, my mind whirling with questions. What kind of trouble was Blake in now? And more importantly, how could I use it to my advantage? Over the next few days, I made it a point to keep a closer eye on Blake's comings and goings. I noticed him taking more and more clandestine meetings, always with different, shady-looking characters. It was clear that whatever he was involved in, it was deep and far-reaching, and if my hunch was correct, it could be the key to finally bringing down the entire Turner empire. As I shared my observations with Jennifer, her eyes lit up with a fierce determination. "We need to get to the bottom of this," she said, her voice steely. "No matter what it takes." And so we hatched a plan. We would tail Blake, document his every move, and gather as much evidence as possible about his secret dealings. It was a risky move, but one we were both willing to take. The first few times we followed him, it was relatively uneventful. Blake would meet with his associates, exchange hushed words and cryptic documents, and then go on his way. But then, one night, everything changed. We had been tailing Blake for hours, watching as he bounced from one seedy location to the next. Finally, he pulled up to a rundown warehouse on the outskirts of town. "This is it," Jennifer whispered, her grip tightening on the steering wheel. "I can feel it." We watched with bated breath as Blake slipped inside, disappearing into the shadows. After a few tense minutes, we decided to follow, our hearts pounding in our chests. What we saw inside that warehouse would change everything. After months of meticulous planning and gathering evidence, the time had finally come to confront Blake and his family head-on. With a deep breath, I steeled my nerves and rang the doorbell of the Turner estate, Jennifer by my side. The door swung open, and there stood Melanie, perfectly coiffed as always. Her eyes widened in surprise when she saw us. Well, if it isn't the scorned ex and her mother," she sneered. "Come to beg for scraps." Before I could respond, Carolyn's shrill voice echoed from inside. "Who is it, Melanie?" "Just some unwanted guests," Melanie called back, her lips curling into a smug smile. Carolyn appeared in the doorway, her face twisting into a scowl. "You two have some nerve showing up here." I held up the ring box, my hand steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "I'm here to return the ring, Carolyn, and to settle some unfinished business." Carolyn scoffed. "Get out of my house before I call the authorities." But I stood my ground, feeling a surge of confidence wash over me. "Not until you hear what I have to say." Melanie rolled her eyes. This should be good. Ignoring her jab, I pulled out my phone and hit play on the damning recordings we had gathered. Blake's voice filled the air, discussing shady business deals and misappropriation of company funds. Carolyn's face drained of color as she listened, her eyes widening in horror. "Blake, what have you done?" As if on cue, Blake himself appeared, his expression turning to one of panic when he saw us. "Harper? Mom, what's going on?" "You tell us, son," David's gruff voice came from behind him. "Care to explain these recordings?" Blake opened and closed his mouth like a fish out of water, but no words came out. Melanie, however, found her voice. "Blake, you assured me everything was above board. You lied to me." The tension in the air was palpable as the Turners turned on each other, accusations and insults flying back and forth. In the chaos, Jennifer leaned over and whispered in my ear, "Their empire is crumbling, just as we planned." I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. The Turners had brought this upon themselves, and now they were reaping what they had sown. As Melanie stormed off in a huff, her perfect facade finally shattered, Blake rounded on me, his eyes blazing with fury. "You did this," he spat. "You and your mother have gone too far." I met his gaze unflinchingly. "No, Blake. You brought this on yourself with your lies and deceit. It's time to face the consequences." With those words, I turned and walked away, leaving the Turners to their imploding empire. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. The fallout from our explosive confrontation at the Turner estate was swift and severe. Blake's family was in complete disarray, their carefully constructed facade crumbling around them. As the news of Blake's shady dealings and misuse of company funds hit the media, the Turners found themselves under intense scrutiny from the public and the authorities alike. Carolyn and David were forced to make a humiliating public statement, apologizing for their son's misdeeds and vowing to cooperate with any investigations. But even as their empire teetered on the brink of collapse, the Turners remained defiant, lashing out at anyone and everyone they could. Blake, in particular, seemed to have lost all sense of reason. "This is all your fault," he raged at me one day, as we crossed paths in the office. "You and your mother have destroyed everything." I met his gaze coolly, unfazed by his outburst. "We only exposed the truth, Blake. Your own actions did the rest." He let out a bitter laugh. "Truth? You have no idea what the truth is, Harper." Before I could respond, he leaned in close, his eyes burning with a mix of anger and desperation. "You think you've won, but this is far from over. I'll make sure you and your mother pay for what you've done." His words sent a chill down my spine, but I refused to show any fear. "Is that a threat, Blake?" He stepped back, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "Take it however you want, Harper. Just know that no one crosses me and gets away with it." With that ominous warning, he turned and stormed off, leaving me to wonder just how far he was willing to go to exact his revenge. In the days that followed, the Turner family's dirty laundry continued to be aired for all to see. It seemed like every day brought a new bombshell revelation, from shady business deals to illicit affairs and everything in between. And through it all, Blake remained defiant, refusing to take responsibility for his actions. Instead, he doubled down on his threats against me and my mother, making it clear that he wouldn't rest until he saw us suffer. But as the walls closed in on the Turners, a surprising ally emerged, Melanie, Blake's former fiancée. Scorned and betrayed by the man she thought she knew, she had no qualms about spilling every sordid detail of their relationship and Blake's misdeeds. "He lied to me from the start," she revealed in a tell-all interview. "I was just another pawn in his game, a means to an end." As Melanie's revelations hit the airwaves, the public's outrage towards Blake and his family reached a fever pitch. Protests erupted outside the Turner estate, with people demanding justice and accountability. And through it all, I remained steadfast, my resolve only strengthened by the knowledge that we were on the right side of this battle. Blake and his family had brought this reckoning upon themselves, and now they were facing the consequences of their actions. As the dust settled and the Turners' once mighty empire lay in ruins, I couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. We had fought for what was right, and in the end, the truth had prevailed. In the aftermath of the Turner family scandal, the fallout was swift and severe. Blake's father, David, was forced to resign from his position as CEO of the company, and Carolyn found herself ostracized from the social circles she once ruled with an iron fist. As for Blake himself, he faced a slew of legal troubles, with investigations into his shady business dealings and misuse of company funds. It was a humiliating downfall for someone who had once seemed so untouchable. Through it all, I couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. After months of meticulous planning and execution, our revenge had been achieved. The Turners' once mighty empire was in shambles, their reputation in tatters. "They got what they deserved," Jennifer said to me one evening, a satisfied smile on her face. "Their empire is crumbling, and it's all thanks to us." I nodded, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. We had fought for justice, and in the end, the truth had prevailed. In the weeks that followed, I found myself adjusting to a new normal. The company I worked for had undergone a major restructuring in the wake of the Turner scandal, and I was transferred to a different department, far away from the toxic environment that had once surrounded Blake and his family. It was a fresh start, and one that I embraced wholeheartedly. Gone were the days of walking on eggshells and dealing with Blake's constant harassment. Instead, I was able to focus on my work and thrive in a supportive, positive environment. As for my personal life, I found myself taking a step back from the dating scene. After the betrayal I had experienced with Blake, I was wary of opening my heart too quickly. But deep down, I knew that one day, when the time was right, I would find someone who truly deserved my love and trust. In the meantime, I poured my energy into my career and my relationship with my mother. Jennifer and I had grown even closer through our shared ordeal, and we found strength in each other's support. "You're an inspiration, Harper," she told me one day, her eyes shining with pride. "You never gave up, even when the odds were stacked against us." I smiled, feeling a warmth bloom in my chest. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mom. We're a team, always." As the months passed, the Turner family scandal faded from the headlines, but the lessons I had learned would stay with me forever. I had seen firsthand the consequences of greed, deceit, and entitlement, and I vowed never to let those toxic traits take root in my own life. Instead, I focused on cultivating patience, discernment, and a strong moral compass. I knew that true happiness and fulfillment could only come from living an authentic, honest life, something that the Turners had clearly failed to grasp. And as for the future, well, the possibilities were endless. With the weight of revenge lifted from my shoulders, I felt free to pursue new opportunities and embrace whatever challenges life had in store. One thing was certain: I would never again let anyone underestimate me or treat me like a second-class citizen. The Turners had learned that lesson the hard way, and I was all the stronger for it. I smoothed my apron for the 100th time, trying to calm my nerves as I listened to the raised voices coming from the living room. It was happening again. Sam and his mother were at it, their argument echoing through our shared home. "You can't keep meddling in our lives, Mom." Sam's voice cracked with frustration. "I'm not meddling, I'm helping," his mother retorted. "Someone has to keep this family together." I sighed, setting down the dish I'd been drying. It was always like this. Ever since Sam's parents moved in with us last year, the tension had been building. I'd tried to be the perfect daughter-in-law, but nothing seemed good enough for Margaret. The kitchen door swung open and Sam stormed in, his face flushed. "Abby, I can't take it anymore. She's driving me crazy." I reached out to touch his arm. "What happened this time?" He ran a hand through his hair. "She's been going through our bills, can you believe it? Says we're not managing our money right." "What?" I felt my own anger rising. "That's none of her business." I know. Sam leaned against the counter, deflated. "I told her to back off, but you know how she is." The kitchen door opened again, and Margaret swept in, her eyes narrowing when she saw us together. "Samuel, we're not finished discussing this." I stepped forward, forcing a smile. "Margaret, maybe we could all sit down and talk about this calmly?" She turned her steely gaze on me. "Abigail, dear, this is a family matter. Why don't you go finish the dishes?" I felt my cheeks burn. "I am family, Margaret. I'm your son's wife." "Of course you are," she said, her tone dismissive. "But you don't understand how things work in our family." Sam put his arm around me. "Mom, that's enough. Abby's right. We should all talk about this together." Margaret's lips thinned. "Fine, let's sit down then." We moved to the dining room, the tension thick in the air. I sat next to Sam, across from his parents. His father, Robert, looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting between us. "Now," Margaret began, folding her hands on the table, "I think it's time we discussed the family finances." I couldn't hold back anymore. "With all due respect, Margaret, our finances are not your concern." She laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "Oh, but they are, dear. You see, this house, it's still in our name." I felt the blood drain from my face. "What?" Sam turned to his father. "Dad, is that true?" Robert cleared his throat. "Well, yes, we never got around to transferring the deed." "You told us this was our house," I exclaimed, my voice rising. "We've been paying the mortgage." Margaret smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "And we appreciate that, but as long as our name is on the deed, we have a say in how things are run here." I looked at Sam, expecting him to protest, but he was staring at the table, his jaw clenched. "Sam?" I whispered, my heart pounding. He finally looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and defeat. "I'm sorry, Abby, I didn't know." In that moment, something shifted. I saw my husband and his family in a new unsettling light. This wasn't just about bills or a house. This was about control, about power. As I sat there, stunned into silence, I realized that everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, was built on shifting sand. And for the first time since I'd married into this family, I felt a spark of something dangerous ignite within me. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. "Excuse me," I muttered, fleeing the room. As I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, I heard Margaret's voice floating up behind me. "See, Samuel? This is why we need to step in. She clearly can't handle adult conversations." I closed the door behind me, leaning against it as tears threatened to spill. But beneath the hurt and betrayal, a new feeling was taking root. Determination. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. I couldn't sleep that night, tossing and turning as memories flooded my mind. Each recollection was like a piece of a puzzle, finally falling into place to reveal a picture I'd been too blind to see. The first Thanksgiving after our wedding, when Margaret accidentally spilled cranberry sauce on my new tablecloth. "Oh, Abigail," she'd said, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "you really should use better quality linens. These cheap ones stain so easily." Sam's birthday last year, when she'd taken over the party planning. "It's just that I know what Samuel likes," she'd explained, patting my hand condescendingly. "You'll learn eventually, dear." And just last month, when she'd rearranged our entire kitchen while I was out grocery shopping, "I couldn't stand to see it so disorganized," she'd said, ignoring my shocked expression. "Now it's much more efficient." I sat up in bed, my heart racing. How had I not seen it before? The constant criticism, the undermining, the control. It wasn't just annoying behavior, it was manipulation. The next morning, I found Sam in the kitchen, looking exhausted. "Hey," he said, barely meeting my eyes. "About last night." I cut him off. "Why didn't you tell me about the house, Sam?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I honestly didn't know, Abby. Dad always said it would be ours." "But you never checked? Never thought to ask for the paperwork?" "I trusted them," he said, his voice small. "They're my parents." I felt a surge of frustration. "And what about trusting me? Your wife?" Before he could answer, Margaret swept into the kitchen. "Good morning, dears. Samuel, I've been thinking about what we discussed last night. I think it's time we had a family meeting about the household budget." I gritted my teeth. "Margaret, we've already told you." Now, she interrupted, holding up a hand. "Let's not get emotional. This is about what's best for the family." I looked at Sam, silently pleading for him to stand up to her. He cleared his throat. "Mom, maybe we could discuss this later?" "Nonsense," she said briskly. "There's no time like the present," she called out. "Come down here, please. We're having a family meeting." As Robert shuffled in, looking uncomfortable, I felt something inside me snap. "No," I said firmly. "We're not having a family meeting. Not now, not ever." Margaret's eyes widened in shock. "I beg your pardon?" "You heard me," I continued, my voice growing stronger. "This is our home, our life. You don't get to make decisions for us anymore." "Abigail," she gasped, clutching her chest dramatically. "How dare you speak to me like that? After everything we've done for you?" I laughed bitterly. "Done for me? You mean criticizing every decision I make, undermining my role in this family, making me feel like I don't belong in my own home?" Sam stepped forward, his face pale. "Abby, calm down. Let's not say things we'll regret." I turned to him, my eyes blazing. "And you? When are you going to stand up to her, Sam? When are you going to choose our marriage over her control?" The kitchen fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Margaret's face had turned an alarming shade of red, while Robert looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Sam opened his mouth to speak, but I held up a hand. "No, I'm done talking. I'm done pretending everything is fine when it's not. Something has to change, and it has to change now." With that, I stormed out of the kitchen, my heart pounding. As I climbed the stairs, I heard Margaret's shrill voice behind me. "Samuel, are you going to let her speak to me like that? To us? Your family?" I paused at the top of the stairs, waiting for Sam's response. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. Finally, I heard his voice, quiet but clear. "Mom, I think Abby's right. We need to talk about some changes." As I closed the bedroom door behind me, I felt a mix of emotions swirling inside me. Anger, fear, but also a glimmer of hope. The battle lines had been drawn. Now it was time to fight for my marriage, my home, and my self-respect. Little did I know this was just the beginning of a war that would change everything. I needed to get out of the house. The tension was suffocating, and I could feel Margaret's disapproving glare burning into my back every time I passed her. I grabbed my gardening gloves and headed for the backyard, hoping some fresh air would clear my head. As I knelt in the dirt, yanking out weeds with more force than necessary, I heard a familiar voice call out. "Abigail? Everything all right over there?" I looked up to see Ellen, my next-door neighbor, peering over the fence. Her kind face was creased with concern. "Oh, Ellen," I sighed, brushing the dirt from my hands. "I don't even know where to start." She opened the gate between our yards and came to sit beside me on the garden bench. "Well, honey, why don't you try the beginning?" The words tumbled out of me like a dam bursting. I told her everything. The revelation about the house, Margaret's constant interference, Sam's inability to stand up to his mother. By the time I finished, tears were streaming down my face. Ellen handed me a tissue from her pocket. "Oh, Abigail, I had no idea things were so bad." "I didn't either," I admitted. "Or maybe I did, and I just didn't want to see it." She patted my hand. "It's not your fault, dear. Some people are masters at manipulation. They can make you doubt your own mind." I nodded, feeling a wave of relief wash over me. Finally, someone understood. "The question is," Ellen continued, her voice gentle but firm, "what are you going to do about it?" I took a deep breath. I think we need to move out, start fresh, just Sam and me." Ellen's eyebrows shot up. "That's a big step. Have you talked to Sam about this?" Before I could answer, I heard the back door slam. Sam strode across the yard, his face tight with anger. "Abby, we need to talk. Now." I stood up, my heart racing. "Sam, what's wrong?" He glanced at Ellen, then back at me. "Inside, please." I followed him into the house, throwing an apologetic look at Ellen over my shoulder. As soon as the door closed behind us, Sam rounded on me. "What did you say to my mother?" he demanded. I blinked, taken aback. "What? I haven't said anything to her since this morning." "Well, she's upstairs crying her eyes out, saying you've turned the whole family against her." I felt a surge of anger. "Are you kidding me? After everything she's done, she's playing the victim?" Sam ran a hand through his hair, frustration etched on his face. "Look, I know things have been tense, but she's still my mother. You can't just—" "Can't what, Sam?" I interrupted. "Can't stand up for myself? Can't expect to be treated with respect in my own home?" "That's not what I meant," he backpedaled. "I just think we need to handle this delicately." I laughed bitterly. "Delicately? Like how she's been so delicate in tearing me down for years?" Sam's face softened. "Abby, please, let's just calm down and—" "No," I said firmly. "I'm done calming down. I'm done pretending everything is okay when it's not. We need to make a change, Sam, a big one." His eyes narrowed. "What are you saying?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "I'm saying we need to move out, find our own place, just the two of us." The color drained from Sam's face. "Move out, but this is our home, our family." "Your family," I corrected, "not mine. Never mine, according to your mother." Sam opened his mouth to respond, but was cut off by a shrill voice from upstairs. "Samuel, who are you talking to down there?" We both froze, staring at each other. In that moment, I saw something shift in Sam's eyes. A flicker of understanding, maybe even agreement. But before he could speak, Margaret appeared at the top of the stairs, her eyes red and puffy. "Oh," she said, her voice dripping with false surprise. "It's you, Abigail. I thought I heard voices." As she descended the stairs, I felt my resolve harden. This was it, the moment of truth. I looked at Sam, silently pleading with him to stand with me, to choose our marriage over his mother's manipulation. His gaze darted between me and Margaret, indecision written all over his face. And in that suspended moment, with the air thick with tension, I realized that everything, my marriage, my future, my sanity, hinged on what happened next. I couldn't sleep that night, my mind racing with the confrontation that was to come. As the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, I made my decision. It was time to talk to Sam, really talk to him, about our future. I found him in the kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee. His eyes were rimmed with dark circles, mirroring my own sleepless night. "Sam," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "we need to talk about what happened yesterday." He nodded, gesturing for me to sit. "I know, Abby. I've been thinking about it all night." I took a deep breath. I meant what I said. We need to move out, set some boundaries with your parents. Sam's grip tightened on his mug. Abby, that's a big step. This is our home. Is it? I interrupted. Because from where I'm standing, it feels like we're just guests in your parents' house. Guests who pay the mortgage, but still have no say. He flinched at my words. That's not fair. They've done a lot for us. And we're grateful, I said, trying to keep my voice level. But Sam, can't you see how your mother's behavior is tearing us apart? We need our own space, our own life. Sam ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized as a sign of his internal struggle. I hear you, Abby. I do. But they're my family. I can't just abandon them. And what about me? I asked, my voice cracking. Aren't I your family, too? The silence that followed was deafening. I watched emotions play across Sam's face. Guilt, confusion, and something else I couldn't quite name. Finally, he spoke. Of course you are. You're my wife. I love you. Then prove it, I said, reaching across the table to take his hand. Stand with me on this. Let's start our life together, just us. Sam opened his mouth to respond, but was cut off by the sound of footsteps on the stairs. Margaret appeared in the doorway, her eyes narrowing as she took in our clasped hands. Good morning, she said, her voice syrupy sweet. I hope I'm not interrupting anything. I felt Sam's hand tense in mine, but I didn't let go. Actually, Margaret, we were just discussing. Oh, I'm sure it can wait, she interrupted, bustling into the kitchen. Samuel, dear, I need your help with something in the garage. That old chest of drawers is just too heavy for your father and me to move. I saw the conflict in Sam's eyes as he looked between his mother and me. My heart sank as he slowly pulled his hand away. I'll be right there, Mom, he said, not meeting my gaze. As Margaret swept out of the room, Sam turned to me. We'll finish this conversation later, okay? I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As he left the kitchen, I felt a surge of determination. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I spent the rest of the morning in a daze, going through the motions of my daily routine while my mind raced with plans. By the time lunch rolled around, I had made up my mind. I found Sam in the backyard, tinkering with the lawnmower. We need to talk? I said, my voice firm. Now. He looked up. Surprise etched on his face. Abby, I told you we'd finish our conversation later. No, I cut him off. We're doing this now. I've made a decision, Sam. If you won't move out with me, then I'll go alone. His face paled. What? Abby, you can't be serious. I've never been more serious in my life, I said, my heart pounding. I love you, Sam, but I can't live like this anymore. Something has to change, and if you won't make that change with me, then I'll have to do it on my own. As the weight of my words settled between us, I saw a flicker of something in Sam's eyes. Fear, maybe, or realization. This was it, the moment that would define our future. So, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, what's it going to be, Sam? Are you with me, or not? The ball was in his court now, and as I stood there, heart in my throat, I knew that whatever his answer, nothing would ever be the same again. The silence that followed my ultimatum seemed to stretch for an eternity. Sam's face was a canvas of conflicting emotions, shock, fear, and something that looked almost like admiration. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Abby, I don't want to lose you. I felt a glimmer of hope. Then come with me, Sam. Let's start fresh, just the two of us. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I'd seen 1,000 times before. It's not that simple. They're my parents. Abby, I can't just abandon them. And what about me? I countered, my voice rising. Am I supposed to just accept being treated like a second-class citizen in my own home? Sam flinched at my words. No, of course not. But maybe if we talk to them, explain how we're feeling. I cut him off with a bitter laugh. Talk to them? Sam, we've been trying to talk to them for years. Nothing changes. Just then we heard the back door open. Margaret's voice floated out to us. Samuel, are you out here? I need your help with something. I saw the conflict in Sam's eyes as he glanced towards the house. I should go see what she needs. Something inside me snapped. No, Sam, you need to stay here and finish this conversation with your wife. His eyes widened at my tone. Abby, Samuel. Margaret's voice was more insistent now. Sam looked torn, his gaze darting between me and the house. I held my breath, waiting for his decision. To my surprise, he called out, Just a minute, Mom. I'm talking to Abby. I felt a surge of hope, but it was short-lived. Margaret appeared at the back door, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. "What's going on out here?" she demanded, striding towards us. I straightened my spine, ready for the confrontation. "We're discussing our future, Margaret. Sam and I are thinking about moving out." The color drained from Margaret's face. "Moving out? But why? This is your home." "Is it?" I challenged. "Because it feels more like your home, where Sam and I just happen to live." Margaret's eyes flashed with anger. "How dare you, after everything we've done for you?" "That's enough, Mom," Sam interrupted, his voice firmer than I'd ever heard it. "Abby's right. We need our own space." I felt a surge of pride and love for my husband in that moment. But Margaret wasn't done. "Samuel, you can't be serious. What about your father and me? We need you here." Sam's resolve seemed to waver. "We won't be far, Mom. We just need." "Need what?" Margaret's voice was shrill now. "To abandon your family? Is that what she's convinced you to do?" I'd had enough. "Stop it, Margaret. This isn't about abandoning anyone. It's about Sam and I having our own life." Margaret turned on me, her eyes blazing. You've poisoned my son against us. I knew from the day he brought you home that you'd try to tear this family apart." "Mom," Sam's voice was sharp. "That's enough." But Margaret was on a roll. "If you leave this house, Samuel, don't bother coming back. You'll no longer be welcome here." The silence that followed was deafening. I looked at Sam, my heart pounding. This was it, the moment of truth. Sam's face was pale, his eyes wide with shock. He looked from his mother to me, indecision written all over his features. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I was about to say. "Sam, I love you, but I can't live like this anymore. If you choose to stay, I'll understand, but I'm leaving, with or without you." The ball was in Sam's court now. As I stood there, heart in my throat, I knew that his next words would determine the course of our future. The tension in the air was palpable as Sam opened his mouth to speak. The tension in the room was suffocating as Sam's words hung in the air. "We're moving out," he said, his voice firm but tinged with sadness. "Abby and I need our own space." Margaret's face contorted with rage. "How dare you, after everything we've done for you?" I stepped forward, my heart pounding. "This isn't about what you've done for us, Margaret. It's about what we need to do for our marriage." Sam's father, Robert, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "Now let's all calm down and discuss this rationally." But Margaret was beyond reason. "Rational? There's nothing rational about abandoning your family. This is all her doing." She pointed an accusing finger at me. I felt a surge of anger. "Stop blaming me for everything, Margaret. Your son is capable of making his own decisions." Sam put a hand on my arm, his touch steadying me. "Mom, this isn't Abby's fault. We've both decided this is what's best for us." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but I could see the calculation behind them. "Samuel, if you walk out that door, don't bother coming back. You'll no longer be welcome in this house." I watched Sam's face, my heart in my throat. This was the moment of truth. To my relief and pride, Sam stood his ground. "If that's how you feel, Mom, then I guess this is goodbye." As we turned to leave, Margaret's voice stopped us cold. "Fine, go, but don't think you'll get away with this. That house belongs to us, remember? You'll have nothing." I froze, the implications of her words sinking in. We'd been paying the mortgage, but the deed was still in their name. How could I have forgotten that crucial detail? Sam's face paled. "Mom, you wouldn't." "Try me," she hissed. Robert stepped forward, looking uncomfortable. "Margaret, maybe we should." "Stay out of this, Robert," she snapped. I felt a wave of desperation wash over me. Everything we'd worked for, everything we'd built, was slipping away. But I refused to let Margaret win. "Fine," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Keep the house. We'll start over somewhere else." Sam looked at me, surprise and admiration in his eyes. "Abby, are you sure?" I nodded, squeezing his hand. "We have each other. That's all that matters." As we packed our belongings, the atmosphere in the house was thick with tension. Margaret alternated between icy silence and tearful pleas, while Robert hovered uncertainly in the background. Just as we were about to leave, Ellen appeared at the door. "I heard raised voices," she said, concern etched on her face. "Is everything okay?" I felt a rush of gratitude for my friend. "We're leaving, Ellen, for good." Understanding dawned in her eyes. She pulled me into a tight hug. "You're doing the right thing, honey. Stay strong." As we loaded the last of our boxes into the car, I saw Robert approach Sam. They spoke in hushed tones, and I saw Sam nod gravely. What was that about? I asked as he slid into the driver's seat. Sam sighed. Dad slipped me some cash, said he was sorry about everything. I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe not all family ties were severed. As we pulled out of the driveway, I saw Margaret watching from the window, her face a mask of anger and hurt. Part of me wanted to feel triumphant, but mostly I just felt sad for her. We drove in silence for a while, the weight of what we'd done settling over us. Finally, Sam spoke. Where do we go from here, Abby? I took a deep breath, realizing I didn't have all the answers. We had no home, little money, and an uncertain future. But we had each other, and that gave me strength. I don't know exactly, I said, reaching for his hand, but we'll figure it out together. As we drove towards an unknown future, I felt a mix of fear and exhilaration. We'd taken a huge risk, but for the first time in years I felt truly free. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I knew we'd face them side by side. Little did I know, the biggest challenge was yet to come. The small apartment we'd rented felt claustrophobic as I paced back and forth, rehearsing the lines I'd prepared. Sam would be home any minute, and I had to make this convincing. My heart raced as I heard his key in the lock. Abby? Sam called out as he entered. I'm home. I took a deep breath and stepped into view, my face a mask of anger. We need to talk, Sam. He froze, sensing the tension in my voice. What's wrong? I can't do this anymore, I said, my voice trembling with feigned emotion. Living like this, cut off from your family, it's tearing me apart. Confusion flickered across Sam's face. But Abby, this was your idea. You wanted to leave. I know what I said, I snapped, internally wincing at the hurt in his eyes. But I was wrong. We've lost everything, Sam. Our home, our security, your family. Sam reached for me, but I stepped back. Abby, please, we can work this out. Just then, right on cue, Sam's phone rang. He glanced at the screen, his face paling. It's Mom, I gestured sharply. Answer it. Put it on speaker. He hesitated, then complied. Margaret's voice filled the room, shrill and demanding. Samuel? Are you there? We need to talk about this ridiculous situation you've gotten yourself into. I watched Sam's face, seeing the conflict in his eyes. Mom, now's not a good time. Nonsense, Margaret interrupted. It's time you came to your senses and came home. You've made your point. Now it's time to stop this foolishness and remember where your loyalties lie. I saw Sam's resolve wavering, and for a moment I feared I'd pushed too far. But then he straightened his shoulders. Mom, I've told you. Abby and I made this decision together. We're not coming back. Margaret's voice turned cold. Is that her talking, or you? Because the Samuel I raised would never turn his back on his family like this. I stepped closer to the phone, my heart pounding. That's enough. Margaret, Sam can make his own decisions. You! Margaret hissed. I knew you were behind all this. You've poisoned my son against us. Well, let me tell you something, Abigail. You might think you've won, but this isn't over. Not by a long shot. The line went dead, leaving us in stunned silence. Sam turned to me, his face a mix of emotions. Abby, I'm so sorry. I never thought she'd go this far. I let my carefully constructed mask slip, revealing the fear and uncertainty beneath. What are we going to do, Sam? She's right. We've lost everything. He pulled me into his arms, and I felt a pang of guilt for my deception. We have each other, he murmured. That's all that matters. As I buried my face in his chest, I heard a sharp knock at the door. We froze, looking at each other in alarm. Sam? Abigail? Are you in there? It was Robert's voice, sounding urgent. Sam opened the door, revealing his father's worried face. Dad, what are you doing here? Robert stepped inside, his eyes darting between us. I had to warn you. Your mother, she's not thinking clearly. She's talking about contesting the mortgage payments, claiming you two were just tenants. She wants to take legal action. I felt the blood drain from my face. She can't do that. We paid for that house. Robert shook his head sadly. I'm afraid she can. The deed is still in our names. Sam's face hardened. This has gone too far. We need to stop her. I nodded, my resolve strengthening. You're right. It's time to end this, once and for all. As we huddled together, planning our next move, I realized that my staged falling out had taken on a life of its own. The lines between deception and reality had blurred, and now everything truly was at stake. I looked at Sam, seeing the determination in his eyes, and knew that whatever came next, we'd face it together. But as Robert filled us in on Margaret's plans, a chill ran down my spine. The real battle was just beginning, and I wasn't sure if we were ready for what lay ahead. The courtroom was silent as we waited for the judge to return with her decision. Sam's hand gripped mine tightly, his palms sweaty with nervous anticipation. Across the aisle, Margaret sat rigid, her eyes fixed straight ahead, while Robert slumped beside her, looking defeated. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of legal battles and emotional turmoil. Margaret had made good on her threats, contesting our claim to the house and accusing us of financial misconduct. But her plan had backfired spectacularly when Robert, pushed to his breaking point, had revealed years of Margaret's own financial deceit. As the judge re-entered the courtroom, I held my breath. This was it, the moment that would determine our future. In the matter of property ownership and financial claims, the judge began, her voice steady, I find in favor of Samuel and Abigail. A collective gasp rippled through the room. I felt Sam's arm wrap around me as relief washed over us both. The judge continued, Furthermore, given the evidence of financial misconduct presented by Mr. Robert Thompson, I am ordering a full audit of the family's finances. I watched as the color drained from Margaret's face. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked truly defeated. As we left the courthouse, Robert approached us hesitantly. Sam, Abigail, can we talk? We nodded, following him to a quiet corner. Robert's shoulders sagged as he turned to face us. I owe you both an apology, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I should have seen what Margaret was doing, how she was tearing this family apart. I was too weak, too afraid to stand up to her. Sam put a hand on his father's shoulder. It's okay, Dad. You did the right thing in the end. Robert shook his head. No, it's not okay, but I want to make it right. He turned to me, his eyes filled with remorse. Abigail, I'm so sorry for everything you've been through. Can you ever forgive me? I felt tears welling up in my eyes. Of course, Robert. Your family. As Robert pulled us both into a hug, I caught sight of Margaret over his shoulder. She stood alone, watching us with a mixture of anger and longing on her face. For a moment, I felt a twinge of pity. Then I remembered all the pain she'd caused, and I turned away. That evening, as Sam and I sat in our small apartment, surrounded by boxes ready for our move back into our rightful home, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I have a confession to make, I said, turning to Sam, his eyebrows raised in question. That fight we had when your dad showed up, I staged it. I thought if I could make your mother show her true colors, you'd finally see how toxic she was. I held my breath, waiting for his reaction. To my surprise, Sam laughed. Oh, Abby, he said, pulling me close. I knew. You knew? I gasped. But how? He smiled, a hint of mischief in his eyes. Because I know you, and I love you, every clever, determined inch of you. As we sat there, planning our future free from Margaret's oppressive influence, I realized that we'd gained so much more than just a house. We'd reclaimed our independence, our self-respect, and our right to live life on our own terms. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were still wounds to heal, trust to rebuild. But as I looked at Sam, I knew we could face anything together. So, I said, a smile playing on my lips, ready for our next adventure? Sam grinned, pulling me in for a kiss. With you? Always. As we sealed our promise with that kiss, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. We'd weathered the storm, emerged stronger, and now, finally, we were free to write our own story. The future stretched out before us, full of possibility and hope, and I couldn't wait to see where it would take us next.
My own parents and wife turned on me when I couldn't give them what they wanted. So, 3 years ago, my life pretty much flipped. I was living pretty normally, married to my now ex-wife, Sarah. Things weren't perfect, but they were all right. I was handling work, Sarah had her job, and we were just two people coasting through life, thinking about maybe starting a family at some point. Nothing crazy, just the usual life stuff. Then came the car accident. It was one of those random crappy days where everything seemed to be going wrong. I was just trying to get home, and then suddenly, bam, some idiot ran a light and I didn't even see it coming. Next thing I knew, I was in the hospital bed, banged up and feeling like I got run over by a freight train. Not the most fun experience, to say the least. They kept me in the hospital for a bit just to make sure I was all right and nothing serious was messed up. Physically, I eventually healed, though I had a lot of downtime trying to get my head back in the right place. But the real kicker came a few months after the accident. I started noticing something weird. My energy was low, and I just felt different. Long story short, my doctors told me the impact had affected my fertility. basically cutting out any natural chance of me having kids. Just like that, my whole life flipped again. I wasn't just recovering from a few broken bones anymore. I was now facing the reality that I might never be able to have a family. And honestly, that hit way harder than any bruise or fracture ever could. When I told Sarah, she looked surprised. Yeah, but her reaction wasn't exactly encouraging. She just sat there, nodding like I'd told her the weather report. I didn't expect her to break down or anything, but some kind of reaction would have been nice, you know? It felt like she'd mentally checked out the minute I told her. Afterward, things got really quiet between us. She wasn't rude or anything, just distant. At first, I chalked it up to her maybe processing things, but after a few weeks of that, it was obvious she was avoiding the whole topic. I tried bringing it up with her a few times, just to see if we were on the same page or if there was something she wanted to talk about, but each time she'd brush it off. She'd say something like, "We'll figure it out," or "Let's not stress about it now." And that was it. No real conversations, no real plans. It's like she didn't want to deal with it at all. Meanwhile, I was already struggling with how much this was messing with my head. I'd always kind of pictured myself as a dad someday. I know, sounds corny, but it was something I wanted, something I was looking forward to. And now, just like that, it was gone. And the one person who was supposed to be in this with me didn't even want to talk about it. I started to feel like I was in this thing on my own. Then there were my parents. Oh man, the way they reacted still blows my mind. My parents always wanted grandkids. They're the traditional type, you know? Think family photos, holiday gatherings, the works. So when I first told them about the accident and everything that came with it, I expected at least a little sympathy, maybe some support. What I got, though, was just silence. They'd ask how I was doing, but only in a "did you heal yet" kind of way. Nothing about how I was feeling mentally or how I was holding up after the fertility news. My dad just kind of nodded, and my mom gave me one of those pity looks like, "Oh, that's too bad." And then, nothing. They changed the subject, started talking about some distant relative's wedding or something like that. It was honestly pretty shocking. Over the next few weeks, I noticed they were calling less, not even checking in on me like they used to. Usually, my mom would call a couple of times a week just to chat, but now it was down to once every couple of weeks, and the conversations felt forced, like she didn't really want to be on the phone with me. The silence became so obvious, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I felt like an outsider in my own family, like I'd been put on the back burner because I couldn't give them the grandkids they'd always wanted. One day I tried to bring it up with them, hoping maybe I was just reading too much into it. I told my mom how hard this whole thing had been on me and how I could really use some support. She got quiet and then sighed, saying something like, "Well, it's just a shame, isn't it?" And that was it. No, we're here for you. No, we'll get through this together. Just a shame. I didn't even know what to say after that. I ended up just nodding along, pretending like her response hadn't stung as much as it did. That's when things really started sinking in. Sarah was distancing herself, and my parents, the people I'd thought would always be there no matter what, were acting like I was some sort of broken appliance they didn't know how to fix. So they just decided to ignore it. It's like, in their eyes, my value dropped the minute they found out I couldn't give them what they wanted. I'd go to work, come home, and sit in this empty apartment, trying to process everything, but I kept coming back to the same question. Was my only worth to these people tied to whether or not I could have kids? I started feeling like I didn't even matter to them as a person. They just saw me as a way to get grandkids, and now that that was off the table, they were done with me. It's a brutal feeling, realizing you're disposable to the people you thought would always have your back. And with Sarah, it was like living with a ghost. We'd have meals together in total silence, or she'd stay late at work, or head out without telling me. I was tiptoeing around my own wife, trying to pretend everything was fine. But deep down, I knew she'd already checked out. I'd lay in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if there was anything I could do to get things back to normal, but I didn't even know where to start. Every time I tried to bring up the future, she'd shut down or brush me off, like my worries were just inconveniences to her. At that point, it felt like I was the only one left trying to keep things together, and I was exhausted. It's one thing to face a problem with the people you love by your side, but it's something else entirely to go through it alone, with everyone acting like you're not even worth the effort. After weeks of trying to push forward, it became pretty clear that Sarah had mentally checked out. It was in the small things she'd stopped doing. No more goodnight kisses, no more random texts during the day, just silence. I started feeling like I was a stranger in my own home. It's not like we were arguing or anything. It was more like she was just done. Every attempt to talk about the future got shut down, and every suggestion of moving forward felt like a burden to her. At one point, I remember sitting her down saying something like, "We need to talk about this," thinking maybe we could find a way to work through it. I wasn't asking for a miracle, I just wanted to know if we were still in this together. But she just sighed, looked at her phone, and said, "I'm exhausted. Can we not do this now?" And that was that. It's hard to explain, but there's this feeling when you realize someone's lost interest in trying, like they're already halfway out the door, and you're just waiting for them to make it official. Meanwhile, my parents were nowhere to be found. Normally, my mom would check in at least once or twice a week, but now it was down to maybe once a month, and even then, the conversations felt forced, like she was doing it out of obligation more than anything else. I tried to reach out a few times, hoping maybe she'd see what I was going through and offer some kind of support, but every call ended the same. Her just saying, "Oh well, life goes on," or something equally dismissive. I was losing everyone who mattered to me, and nobody seemed to care. One night, after another silent dinner with Sarah, I went to bed and just lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out where everything had gone wrong. I mean, I knew the accident had changed things, but I didn't expect it to make everyone treat me like I was some sort of burden they couldn't wait to get rid of. And what's worse was that I started believing it. I started thinking maybe I really was the problem, that somehow, because I couldn't give them the future they'd envisioned, I wasn't worth sticking around for. Around this time, Sarah started spending more time out with friends or working late. It was subtle at first, but then it became a regular thing. She'd come home late, barely say 2 words to me, and go straight to bed. I'd try to ask her about her day or see if she wanted to do something together, but every time it was the same answer. "I'm tired." I knew what that meant, but I kept pretending it was normal. I didn't want to face the reality that she'd already checked out and was just waiting for the right moment to make it official. One day, I decided to ask her directly if everything was okay. I was half hoping she'd laugh it off and tell me I was overthinking things, but instead she just looked at me with this tired, blank expression and said, "I don't know if this is what I want anymore." No anger, no emotion, just a cold, flat statement. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut, but I tried to keep it together. I asked her what she meant, hoping she'd say something I could work with, something we could fix. But she just shrugged and said, "Maybe we're just too different." Too different? We'd been together for years. We'd built a life together, shared everything, gone through tough times. Now, suddenly, we're too different? It didn't make any sense, but it was like she'd already made up her mind. I tried asking her if there was anything I could do to make things right, but she just shook her head, muttering something about how it wasn't about me, but about what she wanted. It was the most confusing, frustrating conversation I'd ever had, and by the end of it, I felt more lost than ever. The next few weeks were brutal. I was doing everything I could think of to make things better, helping around the house, planning little date nights, trying to rekindle what we had, but nothing seemed to make a difference. She'd go through the motions, but I could see in her eyes that she'd already checked out. It was like trying to revive something that was already dead, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. I kept hoping, maybe foolishly, that if I just tried hard enough, I could fix it. Then, one evening, I got home from work to find Sarah sitting on the couch with a stack of papers in front of her. My stomach dropped as soon as I saw them. I knew exactly what they were. She didn't even try to soften the blow, just handed me the divorce papers and said, "I think this is what's best for both of us." It felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life fall apart instead of my own. I asked her if there was any way we could work things out, but she just shook her head, barely making eye contact. I tried to keep my composure, even though I was falling apart inside. I told her I didn't want this, that I was willing to do whatever it took to make things right, but she wasn't interested. She told me she'd been thinking about it for a while and that she'd just reached her limit. I felt like I'd been hit by a truck, but I nodded, signed the papers, and watched as she left without so much as a backward glance. It was like our entire life together had meant nothing to her. After she left, I sat alone in that empty apartment, surrounded by memories of a life that no longer existed. It was like everything had been ripped out from under me, and I was left standing there, trying to piece together what had gone wrong. I'd lost my wife, and my parents were nowhere to be found. My entire support system had crumbled, and there was nothing I could do to bring it back. In the days that followed, I tried reaching out to my parents, hoping maybe they'd see what I was going through and finally be there for me. But every call went to voicemail, every message left unanswered. It was like I'd been erased from their lives, like I didn't even exist anymore. I couldn't understand it. These were the people who raised me, who I thought would always be there no matter what. Now, when I needed them the most, They'd abandoned me completely. The silence was deafening. Every day I'd come home to that empty apartment, no one to talk to, no one to lean on. I'd try to distract myself, but the loneliness was crushing. I felt like I'd been cast aside, like everyone had decided I wasn't worth the effort. It's hard to explain, but there's this feeling that creeps in when you're left all alone, like you're invisible, like you don't even matter. I started questioning everything, wondering if maybe they were right, if maybe I was the problem all along. But deep down, I knew I hadn't done anything to deserve this. I'd done everything I could to make things work, to be there for Sarah, to keep my family close. Yet, here I was, left with nothing but an empty apartment and a whole lot of questions I'd probably never get answers to. After Sarah walked out, I was expecting to be alone for a while, maybe even permanently. I'd finally come to terms with the fact that my family wasn't going to be there for me like I'd always hoped. I thought they'd just let me fade into the background, now that I'd failed to give them the grandkids they'd wanted so badly. But instead of disappearing, they just found new ways to insert themselves into my life and remind me how much of a disappointment they thought I was. The first incident happened a couple of months after the divorce was finalized. My mom called and said she and my dad wanted to come over to check on me. I wasn't thrilled, but a part of me thought, maybe they're actually reaching out this time, trying to make things right. So I agreed to let them come by. They showed up with boxes, literal boxes of my childhood things. Old trophies, dusty certificates, even some embarrassing middle school projects I hadn't seen in ages. They dumped them on my living room floor without any explanation, then stood back like they'd done me some big favor. When I asked why they were suddenly unloading my stuff on me, my mom just shrugged and said, "Well, we're planning to turn your old room into a nursery for when your sister decides to start a family." I was floored. My sister wasn't even dating anyone, as far as I knew, yet they were already prepping my room, my space, for the grandkids they actually cared about. I told them it felt like they were just tossing me aside, and my dad had the nerve to say, "Well, you're not exactly using the space anymore, are you?" That one hit me hard. They didn't even try to hide it. They were done with me, plain and simple. I'd failed to give them what they wanted, so they were cleaning house, literally and emotionally. After they left, I realized I couldn't keep giving them chances. I knew I needed space, so I stopped answering their calls for a while, hoping they'd take the hint. But my mom wasn't about to let me have peace. She started calling from different numbers, and then I started getting texts from her friends, people I hadn't spoken to in years, telling me that I needed to be there for my family. It was like they'd set up an entire guilt-tripping campaign, all because I wasn't living the way they wanted. The next blow came a couple of months later. My dad showed up unannounced at my place one Saturday morning, dragging in my younger cousin Jake. Jake's been a bit of a troublemaker his whole life. Never held down a job, dropped out of school, always needing to borrow money from someone. Apparently, he'd just gotten kicked out of his latest gig and was in need of a place to crash. And for whatever reason, my dad decided that place should be my apartment. I stood there, completely dumbfounded as my dad dumped Jake's bags in my entryway, acting like it was a done deal. I asked why on earth he thought it was okay to drop my cousin off at my place without even asking, and he had the nerve to say, "Jake's family. We all help each other out when times are tough." I almost laughed at the irony. When I was at my lowest, they didn't even blink before cutting me off. But now they expected me to play hero to my cousin? I told my dad flat out that Jake wasn't staying, that he could find somewhere else to crash. My dad rolled his eyes, muttering about how I'd changed and how I was too selfish now. But I held my ground, and eventually, he left, dragging a sulking Jake behind him. After that, things went quiet for a while. I thought maybe they'd finally gotten the message, but I was wrong. A few weeks later, I came home to find an envelope stuffed in my mailbox. Inside was a handwritten letter from my mom, dripping with passive aggressiveness. She went on and on about how I was tearing the family apart by being so distant, and that she didn't recognize the person I'd become. She even threw in a line about how it's no wonder Sarah left, as if I hadn't heard that one enough from her already. And then, in the final paragraph, she dropped a bombshell. They wanted me to sign over a portion of my inheritance to my sister. She wrote that since I couldn't give them grandchildren, it was only fair to give some of my share to my sister, so that her children could have a head start in life. They were basically asking me to hand over part of my future to my sister's hypothetical kids, all because I wasn't fulfilling their dream of having grandkids. I was furious. This wasn't just crossing a line. This was burning the line and then stomping on it. I called my mom, and when she answered, I let her have it. I told her how hurtful it was to see them throw me away like I was nothing, to demand that I sacrifice for a family that had treated me like I didn't matter. She stayed silent for a few seconds, then sighed and said, We just want what's best for the family. You don't understand because you're choosing to be selfish. That was it for me. I realized in that moment that nothing I ever did would be enough for them. I could have handed over everything, bent over backward, and they'd still find a reason to tell me I was failing them. I didn't respond to the letter. I didn't call them back. Instead, I blocked their numbers and started preparing myself for the next wave of entitlement. I knew they wouldn't let this go. And sure enough, a week later, my mom showed up at my door, knocking like she was about to knock the whole thing down. When I opened up, she didn't even say hi. She just walked in, uninvited, looking around like she was inspecting my place. Then, without missing a beat, she went off on a tirade about family obligations and how it was my duty to support my sister, to keep the family whole after everything I'd put them through. She had the nerve to act like I was some black sheep, someone who'd wronged them by simply existing. I told her I wasn't giving anything to my sister, that it wasn't my responsibility to fund their dream life. She looked at me, absolutely disgusted, and said, "Well, if that's the way you want it, don't expect to be part of this family anymore." As she stormed out, I realized that was exactly what I wanted. I was done with their expectations, their demands, their constant reminders of how I'd failed to live up to their perfect vision. I didn't want to be part of a family that only valued me for what I could give them. I wanted peace, and for the first time, I was okay with walking away to find it. That was the day I took back control. And even though I knew there'd be fallout, I knew it was worth it. After a year of trying to put myself back together, I was finally starting to feel like my old self again, just a little rougher around the edges. I was living my life without tiptoeing around anyone's expectations. I'd reconnected with some friends, picked up a few new hobbies, and honestly, I'd stopped looking back. It was around this time that I met Emily. We didn't meet through an app or on some planned setup. It was completely random. I'd signed up for a photography class at the community center, one of those things I'd been wanting to try for a while, but never had the time or guts to do. Emily was in the same class, and she'd been doing photography for a while, but mostly as a hobby. I noticed her right away because she seemed genuinely interested, not just in the technical stuff, but in the little stories you could tell through photos. She was one of those people who could take a picture of a sidewalk, and somehow, it would feel like it had a life of its own. I didn't think much of it at first. I figured she was just another classmate. But after a couple of sessions, we started chatting here and there, mostly about the assignments. She was down to earth, funny, and had this effortless way of making everyone around her feel comfortable. It was nice, not having to pretend or put on some sort of act. She was just real. One day after class, a group of us decided to go grab coffee nearby. Emily and I ended up sitting next to each other, and before I knew it, we were deep in conversation. We didn't talk about anything crazy, just random stuff. Favorite movies, weird travel experiences, why we even bothered signing up for a class when most people would just watch a YouTube tutorial. I remember thinking how easy it was to talk to her, like we'd known each other for ages. There was no awkwardness, no forced small talk, just a genuine conversation with someone who actually listened. As the weeks went by, we kept hanging out after class, sometimes just us, other times with a group. But even when there were other people around, it felt like it was just the two of us. I wasn't thinking about dating or getting into anything serious. I'd learned my lesson with rushing things, but I couldn't deny there was something special about Emily. I hadn't felt this kind of connection in, well, maybe ever. It wasn't based on some shared idea of what our lives were supposed to look like. It was just two people enjoying each other's company. After a couple of months, Emily and I started spending more time together outside of class. We'd go for walks, check out local art shows, grab food from random food trucks in the city. Nothing big, just little things that ended up meaning a lot. She had this way of making every moment feel like its own adventure, even if we were just wandering around the city with no real plan. For the first time since my divorce, I wasn't constantly looking over my shoulder or waiting for the other shoe to drop. With Emily, it was just easy. Eventually, I opened up to her about my past. It wasn't something I was looking forward to, but I felt like if this was going anywhere, she deserved to know. So one night, after we'd gone to this hole-in-the-wall diner we found, I told her everything. About Sarah, the accident, my family's reaction to my infertility, everything. I expected her to look at me with pity, maybe some discomfort, but she just listened, nodding every now and then. When I was done, she didn't act shocked or sad. She just said, "That sounds really rough. You're pretty strong for getting through all that." It was such a simple thing to say, but it meant the world to me. No one had ever put it like that before. People either acted like I was broken or just brushed it off like it didn't matter. But Emily? She just got it. No drama, no pity, just understanding. That was probably the moment I realized I wanted more than friendship with her, though I didn't say anything just yet. I was cautious, probably more than I needed to be, but I didn't want to mess this up. A few weeks later, Emily invited me to this event her friends were hosting, a small art show where they were displaying some of their work. She'd been helping out with the setup and thought it'd be fun for me to tag along. It was a bit nerve-wracking meeting her friends, but they were just like her, laid back, creative, and not judgmental at all. I ended up having a great time, and afterward, as we walked back to her place, I could feel this unspoken shift between us. It wasn't anything big or dramatic, just a quiet understanding that we both wanted something more. The next time we hung out, I finally worked up the nerve to ask her out properly. I was nervous as hell, not gonna lie. I'd been through so much that the idea of opening up to someone again scared me, but with Emily, it felt like a risk worth taking. She smiled, nodded, and just said, "I'd love to." Simple as that. Dating Emily was nothing like my previous relationship. With her, there was no pressure to be anything other than who I was. She never made me feel like I had to prove myself or live up to some impossible standard. She accepted me, flaws and all, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I was carrying the weight of someone else's expectations. I could just be me, and that was enough. We started spending almost every weekend together, exploring the city, taking little road trips, and finding new hobbies. She even got me back into photography, which had taken a back seat for a while. I hadn't felt this alive in years. There was this ease to our relationship, a comfort I'd never experienced before. Emily had this way of making even the smallest moments feel special, like every second counted. And then, something I thought was impossible happened. I got some unexpected news from the doctor. Turns out my treatments had worked better than I'd ever hoped. I wasn't just maybe able to have kids. I was actually capable of starting a family. No additional treatments needed. It was a shock, honestly, but an incredible one. I remember telling Emily, half expecting her to freak out, but she just smiled and said, "Maybe it was meant to be." It was a lot to process, but Emily's calm, grounded reaction made it easier. She didn't act like this huge news changed anything about us. She just accepted it as part of our story, and that's when I knew, beyond a doubt, that she was the one. After I got that news from the doctor, life felt different. Like, for the first time in years, I didn't have this heavy weight on my shoulders. I told Emily everything, and we both agreed to take things one step at a time. We didn't have to rush into anything, and honestly, I was just enjoying life with her, seeing where things would go naturally. But a few months later, we found out we were expecting. The day we found out we were having a baby girl, I couldn't believe it. I mean, after everything I'd gone through, all the treatments, all the struggles, I was actually going to be a dad. Emily was glowing, already picking out names and little baby outfits, and I'll admit, I got pretty into it too. I'd wander through stores and find myself holding tiny shoes, imagining our little girl walking around someday. I'd never thought I'd get a chance to be a dad, so every part of it felt like a miracle. As we prepared for our daughter's arrival, we kept things quiet. I was still keeping my distance from my family, and most of my old connections were out of the picture. I hadn't bothered letting my parents know anything about my life for years, and I didn't see a reason to start now. My life had moved on without them, and honestly, I was fine with that. I had Emily, my little family, and I was finally at peace. One afternoon, Emily and I were taking our daughter, who was only a few months old, out for a walk around the neighborhood. She was sleeping soundly in the stroller, and we were just talking about random stuff, our plans, the future, silly things she did as a baby. It was one of those perfect, peaceful days, and that's when I saw them, my parents. They were walking down the same street, coming out of a house a few doors down. I guess they were visiting someone in the area, but it was the last thing I expected. I froze. I didn't know what to do, and part of me thought about turning around and just walking away. But before I could even move, they spotted me. My mom's eyes lit up when she saw us, like she'd just won the lottery or something. She nudged my dad, and they started walking over, all smiles, like they'd just seen their long-lost son. It was surreal. They came up to us, glancing at the stroller, probably putting two and two together. My mom's first words were, is this your daughter?" She looked genuinely shocked, like she couldn't believe I'd actually gone on to have a family without their help. I nodded, keeping things short, and they both stared at her like they were seeing a ghost. I could tell they wanted to ask a million questions, but I wasn't about to make this reunion easy for them. My dad finally spoke up, saying something like, "We're glad to see you're doing well. We've missed you." And that's when all the memories started flooding back. The years of silence, the way they'd treated me when I was at my lowest, and how they basically wrote me off when I couldn't give them what they wanted. Now here they were, acting like we just had some minor disagreement, expecting me to welcome them back with open arms just because they finally decided to show up. I kept my tone calm, but I made it clear I hadn't forgotten what they did. I told them straight up, "You walked out of my life when I needed you most. You abandoned me. I had to rebuild everything on my own, and now you want back in because you see me with a family? It doesn't work that way." My mom looked stunned, like she didn't know how to respond, and my dad just kind of nodded, not saying anything. They tried to play the sympathy card, talking about how hard it was for them when they found out I couldn't have kids. They started making it sound like they were the victims, like I'd somehow hurt them by not being able to give them grandkids back then. I could feel the anger bubbling up, but I wasn't going to let them manipulate me. I'd been through too much to let them guilt trip me into forgiving them. I told them, "I'm not going to pretend like nothing happened. You cut me off when I was struggling, made me feel like I wasn't worth anything because I couldn't give you what you wanted. And now that I have a family, you think you can just walk back in?" My mom looked like she was going to cry, and my dad tried to reason with me, saying that they'd always loved me, and that they just made mistakes. But I was done with their excuses. I'd spent too many nights wondering if I'd done something wrong, wondering why my own family had abandoned me. And now, with my daughter and Emily by my side, I realized that I didn't need them to validate me anymore. I had the family I always wanted, and they weren't going to be part of it. After a few awkward moments of silence, my mom finally asked if they could meet their granddaughter. She reached out toward the stroller, like she expected me to just hand her over. That was my breaking point. I stepped in front of the stroller, putting myself between them and my daughter. I told them flat out, "You lost the right to be part of my life, and you sure as hell aren't going to be part of hers. I don't owe you that." They looked genuinely shocked, like they couldn't believe I'd shut them out so completely. My mom started pleading, saying they'd do anything to make things right, but I wasn't interested in hearing it. I'd given them enough chances, and they'd shown me exactly who they were. I wasn't going to risk letting them back into my life just so they could hurt me, or worse, my daughter. Before they could say anything else, I just told them, "This is the life I built without you. I don't need you, and neither does she." With that, I turned the stroller around and walked away, not looking back. Emily squeezed my hand, giving me a supportive smile, and in that moment, I felt this overwhelming sense of relief. For the first time, I wasn't letting them have power over me. That was the end of it. I'd faced them, stood my ground, and finally put the past behind me. My parents had missed out on my life, and now they'd miss out on my daughter's too. And honestly, I didn't feel a shred of guilt. They'd made their choice, and I'd made mine. As we walked back home, I felt this incredible sense of peace, like a weight had been lifted. I looked down at my daughter, asleep in her stroller, and knew I'd made the right decision. I'd given her the best gift I could, the promise that she'd grow up surrounded by people who truly loved her, people who would never walk out on her when things got tough. That day, I closed the door on my past for good. I had my family, my real family, and I was finally free to move forward without any regrets. All right, so let me just dive straight into how things went down. I was 10 when my parents split up, and to say I didn't handle it well would be a massive understatement. I mean, what kid is going to take something like that well? But for me, it hit hard. Real hard. Looking back, I guess they just fell out of love or whatever. But at the time, all I could see was that the two people I relied on the most suddenly didn't want to be together anymore. I remember being confused and angry all the time, lashing out at both of them, mostly at my dad, though. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like he was the one responsible for ruining everything. We went through the motions, counseling and all that, but if I'm honest, it was a waste of time. My mom was the only one who seemed like she was really trying to get me or where I was coming from. My dad, on the other hand, had this suck-it-up attitude about everything. He didn't get how much I was hurting, and if I'm being real, I don't think he cared. He was more focused on keeping it all together for himself than thinking about what I was going through. I don't know, maybe that's just how he deals with stuff. We never really connected much after that, and it felt like we were just two strangers living in the same house. I stayed mostly with my mom, which was fine by me because we were always closer. I only went to my dad's place on weekends or for short breaks. Not gonna lie, I kind of dreaded those weekends. It was awkward, and I didn't feel like I belonged there anymore. But things took a turn when I was about 14. That's when my mom decided to remarry. Now, don't get me wrong, I wanted her to be happy. But her new husband, let's just call him Mike, wasn't exactly thrilled about having me around. I don't know if it was me or if he just didn't want a kid who wasn't his own in his life, but the vibes were clear, I wasn't welcome. And then, just like that, my mom made a choice. She picked her new life with him over me. I can't even begin to describe how that felt. It was like one moment she was my rock, the only one who understood me, and the next she was pushing me out of her life. She told me it was for the best, and that I should live with my dad. Yeah, right. For her best, maybe. I was crushed. I felt abandoned. Like, how do you go from being the center of someone's world to being shoved aside because their new husband doesn't want to deal with you? It didn't make sense to me then, and honestly, it still doesn't now. So, I packed up and moved in with my dad and his fiancée, Olivia. Now, Olivia was a piece of work. She'd been with my dad for a while at that point, and she had this weird idea that she could just step in and be my mom or something. I wasn't having any of that. I was still reeling from being ditched by my actual mom, and here's this woman trying to act like everything was normal. I shut that down quick. I didn't need or want another mom, especially not one who didn't get me or my situation. My dad, of course, didn't really notice or care about how I was feeling. He was too busy playing happy family with Olivia to realize that I was struggling. To him, it was like I should just get over it, move on, and adjust to the new family dynamic. But how the hell was I supposed to adjust when my life had been turned upside down? Living with them sucked, plain and simple. Every day felt like I was just trying to survive in a place where I didn't belong. Olivia was always hovering, trying to get me to open up to her or do things as a family. I wasn't interested. The more she pushed, the more I pulled back. And my dad? He acted like everything was fine. Like me being there was no big deal. Meanwhile, I was grieving the fact that my mom had basically ditched me for a guy who couldn't stand the sight of me. There were times when I thought about running away, just leaving and seeing where I ended up. It was that bad. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed, kept my head down, and counted the days until I could get out for good. I threw myself into school, focused on getting into college, and planned my escape that way. I figured if I could just make it to college, I'd be free. All right, so I made it through high school without completely losing my mind, but living with Olivia and my dad was rough. Every day was just tension. Like, there was no big blow up or anything, but it was always there, you know? That feeling that I wasn't wanted. Olivia wasn't mean to me outright, but she had this way of making me feel like I was just in the way, like everything would have been easier if I wasn't around. She never said it, but I could feel it. And then there was Jess, her daughter. Now, Jess wasn't the issue at first. She was all right, we weren't close, but she wasn't a total brat or anything. It was just awkward, because Olivia would constantly go out of her way to make sure Jess was the center of everything. Like, Jess got special treatment for everything. Olivia was constantly pulling strings to make her life easier. Sports teams, school plays, whatever Jess wanted, Olivia would make it happen. And Jess? She kind of just went along with it. She wasn't exactly spoiled rotten, but she didn't push back either. She just accepted that her mom was going to smooth everything over for her no matter what. Meanwhile, I was just in the background trying to stay out of the way and not cause any drama. Living with them was like living in someone else's home. My dad had his own life with Olivia, and I was just there. I mean, sure, I had a room, but it never felt like mine. It was more like a guest room where they just let me crash. I tried to keep busy with school and avoided being home as much as possible. I'd hang out at friends' places or stay late at the library, basically doing anything to not deal with being at the house. But then things started to get complicated when Jess started acting weird. It was like, overnight, she went from just being Olivia's daughter, who I tolerated, to this person who was constantly hovering around whenever I brought someone over, especially when it was Ethan. Yeah, I know I haven't mentioned him yet, but this is where he comes into the picture. So Ethan and I started dating when I was in college. We were both studying at USC, and things were going well between us. He's a good guy, and I really liked him. Naturally, I started bringing him over to my dad's house sometimes, and at first, it was fine. But then, out of nowhere, Jess started acting all weird around him. Like, she'd get super shy and quiet, which wasn't her usual vibe at all. At first, I didn't think too much of it. I just figured maybe she was having a bad day or whatever, but it didn't stop. Every time Ethan came over, Jess would be all flustered like a middle schooler with a crush. She'd hang around when we were trying to talk, asking him random questions, and just being there. It started to get really awkward, but I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. I figured it'd blow over eventually, right? Wrong. It only got worse. Jess was straight up obsessed with Ethan. She started making excuses to be in the same room as us, or she'd just randomly show up when we were hanging out. I even caught her staring at him a few times. It was super uncomfortable, and I didn't know how to handle it at first. I mean, what was I supposed to do? Tell my dad that his fiance's daughter had a crush on my boyfriend? That wouldn't end well, and I knew it. So I tried to handle it myself. I pulled Jess aside one day and straight up asked her if she had feelings for Ethan. She looked like she wanted the ground to swallow her up, but she didn't deny it. She didn't even say anything, just kind of nodded and avoided eye contact. I told her that this was really weird and awkward for me, and she needed to back off. I thought that would be enough to put an end to it, but nope. If anything, it got worse. Jess started acting all dramatic after that. Her grades slipped, and she was moping around the house like she was heartbroken. I'd hear her crying in her room at night, and Olivia, being Olivia, noticed. Of course, she had to get involved. Instead of talking to Jess like a normal parent, Olivia decided that it was somehow my fault that Jess was a mess. She cornered me one day in the kitchen and accused me of flaunting my relationship with Ethan to make Jess feel bad. Like, seriously? How was it my fault that Jess had a crush on my boyfriend? It was ridiculous. But Olivia was dead serious. She told me I needed to be more considerate and suggested that maybe I shouldn't bring Ethan around anymore, for Jess's sake. Yeah, no, that wasn't happening. I told her flat out that I wasn't going to stop seeing Ethan just because Jess had a thing for him. If anything, Jess needed to learn how to deal with her feelings like an adult, not expect me to bend over backward to make her feel better. Olivia didn't like that answer, and she went straight to my dad about it. Now, my dad's always been the kind of guy who avoids conflict, so of course, he tried to play peacemaker. He sat me down one night and gave me this whole speech about how I needed to be more understanding and that maybe I should take a break from seeing Ethan for a while. You know, for the sake of the family. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My dad was seriously suggesting I break up with my boyfriend just because Jess had a crush on him? I laughed in his face. I didn't mean to, but it was so ridiculous I couldn't help it. I told him there was no way I was ending my relationship just because Olivia and Jess couldn't handle their feelings. That conversation turned into a massive argument. My dad kept going on about how I needed to think of Jess's feelings and how I was making things harder for everyone. I just kept telling him that it wasn't my problem. I wasn't going to change my life to make things easier for them. If Jess couldn't handle seeing Ethan around, that was on her, not me. By the end of it, it was clear that things weren't going to get any better. My dad was siding with Olivia, and I wasn't going to give in to their demands. The tension in the house was unbearable after that. I couldn't even look at Jess without feeling angry, and every time Olivia opened her mouth, it was just to make passive-aggressive comments about how hard things were for Jess. I knew then that I couldn't stay there much longer. This wasn't my home anymore. And honestly, I didn't think it ever really was. My dad had chosen his new life with Olivia and Jess, and I was just an outsider. I needed to get out, and fast. So yeah, that's how things went downhill with Jess, Olivia, and my dad. It was like everything was building up to that moment, and once it hit, there was no going back. I was done. Done with the drama, done with the feeling of not belonging. It was time to make a move, and I knew I had to do it soon. So, after that whole mess with Jess and Olivia, things at my dad's house just kept getting worse. I was basically living in a pressure cooker, waiting for the next explosion. Every day felt tense and awkward. If I wasn't at school, I tried to be anywhere but home. It was just getting unbearable. But then things hit a new level of crazy, and that's when I realized I had to get out for real. I guess I should have seen it coming, but it still threw me. One night, my dad asked me to sit down and have a family meeting. Now, if you've ever been in a dysfunctional family, you know that those words usually mean bad news. I wasn't looking forward to it, but I figured, fine, let's get this over with. We all sat down in the living room. Me, my dad, Olivia, and Jess. And honestly, from the looks on their faces, I knew this was going to be some sort of intervention. My dad started off with this whole speech about how the tension in the house was affecting everyone, how we all needed to figure out a way to get along better. I didn't say anything, just nodded along, waiting for him to get to the point. Then Olivia jumps in. She starts talking about how Jess has been struggling lately, which I already knew, and that the situation with Ethan wasn't helping. And I'm just sitting there thinking, great, here we go again. But instead of going down the usual path of blaming me, she drops this bomb on me. We think it would be best if you took a break from seeing Ethan for a while. I swear I almost laughed again. Like, seriously? This again? But she wasn't done. Olivia went on to explain that Jess needed time to process her emotions and that my relationship with Ethan was distracting her from focusing on her own life. She made it sound like I was causing Jess to fail at school or something, which was total BS. At that point, I couldn't hold back. I just said, "You can't be serious. You want me to put my life on hold because Jess has a crush on my boyfriend? How is that my problem?" Olivia didn't like that at all. She got this tight look on her face, and my dad jumped in to back her up, saying that they weren't asking me to break up with Ethan, just to give things some space. I told them flat out that it wasn't happening. There was no way I was going to stop seeing Ethan just because Jess couldn't handle it. If she had a problem, she needed to deal with it, not make it everyone else's issue. The room went dead silent after that. You could cut the tension with a knife. Jess, who had been staring at the floor the whole time, suddenly looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean for it to get this bad." I wasn't expecting that. I mean, I knew Jess had a thing for Ethan, but seeing her like that, so genuinely upset, made me pause for a second. But then Olivia jumped back in, twisting the knife by saying, "We just want what's best for everyone, especially for Jess. We all need to make sacrifices sometimes for the good of the family." At that point, I'd had enough. "Sacrifices?" I snapped. "What have you sacrificed, Olivia? All I've done since I moved in here is try to stay out of your way. I've given up enough. I'm not giving up Ethan, too." My dad didn't say anything for a long moment. He just sat there, looking tired and defeated, like he didn't even want to be part of this conversation anymore. Finally, he sighed and said, "We're just trying to make things work, that's all. We don't want to force you to do anything, but we can't keep living with this tension." I stared at him, wondering how he couldn't see how messed up this whole situation was. I'd always known he wasn't the best at handling emotions, but this was a whole new level of avoidance. Instead of dealing with the real problem, they were all just putting the blame on me. I stood up, and that's when I said it. "I can't do this anymore. I'm done." The words just came out, but as soon as I said them, I knew it was the truth. I couldn't stay there any longer. Living with them wasn't healthy. It was making me angry and resentful, and I deserved better than that. I didn't know where I was going to go or how I was going to make it work, but I couldn't stay there. Olivia looked at my dad, like she couldn't believe I'd actually said it. Jess just sat there, her face crumpled in on itself, looking miserable. And my dad? He didn't even try to stop me. He just nodded, like he expected it. Then my dad said, "If you don't break up with Ethan, I can't let you live here." "Fine," I said. "I'll be out by the end of the week." And that was that. I left the room, went to my room, and started packing. I didn't even know where I was going, but I started putting stuff into boxes anyway. Part of me was angry, but another part of me just felt relieved. I didn't have to deal with their crap anymore. I could just walk away and leave it all behind. Over the next couple of days, I packed up everything I owned. I barely spoke to anyone in the house. Olivia acted like she didn't care, and Jess kept to herself, probably embarrassed about the whole thing. My dad tried to talk to me once, but it was just more of the same. Him trying to make peace without actually fixing anything. I didn't tell him where I was going when I left. I didn't think he even cared. The day I moved out, I loaded up my car, looked back at the house one last time, and then I drove off. I didn't look back. Leaving wasn't easy. I was scared and uncertain about what would happen next, but I also knew that staying in that house wasn't an option anymore. My dad had made his choice. He'd chosen his new family over me, and I wasn't going to stick around and be a second thought in my own life. I didn't really know what the future held for me, but I knew one thing for sure. I was done with the toxic mess my life had become in that house. It was time to figure out who I was and what I wanted without them dragging me down. It was time to start living for me, not for them. So, after I left my dad's house, it was like a weird mix of relief and straight-up panic. I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't have a solid plan or anywhere permanent to stay right away, but I knew I couldn't stay in that toxic mess any longer. It was like getting out of a pressure cooker. Yeah, things were calm for a minute, but now I had to figure out how to survive on my own. At first, I crashed at my friend Kayla's place. She had this tiny apartment not too far from campus, and she was cool enough to let me stay with her for a while. I didn't want to be a burden, so I told her it was temporary, just until I figured things out. I started looking for a job immediately. Even though I was still in school, I knew I had to start making money if I was going to pay for rent and all that. Those first few weeks were rough. I was working random shifts at a 24-hour diner, mostly late nights and weekends. I didn't have much choice. I needed the money. It wasn't the best job in the world, but it paid enough to keep me afloat. Between working, going to class, and studying, I barely had time to think. And honestly, that was probably for the best. But every now and then, when I had a quiet moment, I'd start thinking about everything that had happened with my family. It was hard not to feel angry and a little lost. I mean, I knew I made the right choice by leaving, but that didn't make it any easier to accept that my dad had chosen Olivia and Jess over me. It stung. Bad. It felt like I wasn't even part of his life anymore, like I'd been replaced. The worst part? He didn't even reach out after I left. Not a single phone call or text to see if I was okay. It was like I just disappeared, and he didn't care enough to check. That hurt more than I wanted to admit, but I was trying not to dwell on it too much. I had to focus on building my own life now, without relying on him. After about a month of couch surfing at Kayla's, I finally found a tiny studio apartment that I could afford. It wasn't much, just a small room with a bathroom and a kitchenette, but it was mine. It felt good to have my own space, somewhere I didn't have to walk on eggshells all the time. The first night I slept there, I remember just lying on the floor, since I didn't have any furniture yet, feeling this huge wave of relief. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could actually breathe. But of course, life wasn't going to let me off that easy. About 2 weeks after I moved in, I got a text from my dad. It was short and cold, like he was writing an email to a coworker or something. He said something like, "Hope you're doing well. Let me know when you have time to talk." That was it. No apology, no, "I miss you," nothing. Just a sterile message that felt more like an obligation than him actually wanting to talk. I stared at the message for a long time, trying to figure out how I felt about it. Part of me wanted to reply, to open up some kind of dialogue and maybe, just maybe, fix things. But the other part of me, the part that was still pissed off and hurt, wanted to just ignore him. Why should I be the one to reach out when he hadn't bothered to check on me in weeks? Why should I care when he clearly didn't? In the end, I didn't respond. I just couldn't. It wasn't about being petty or trying to punish him. It was more like, what was the point? What could we possibly say to each other that would fix everything? I wasn't ready to go back to that mess, and honestly, I didn't know if I ever would be. Instead, I threw myself into work and school. I was grinding nonstop, doing whatever I could to keep moving forward. It wasn't easy, but it felt good to be doing something for myself for once. I wasn't living under anyone's roof or dealing with their drama. This was my life now, and I was determined to make it work. Ethan was a huge support during this time. He never pressured me about the whole family situation, but he was there when I needed someone to vent to or just to hang out and distract me from everything. He'd come over to my new place after his classes, and we'd sit on the floor, still no furniture by the way, and just talk about anything but my family. It was nice to have someone who got me without all the baggage attached. But despite trying to move on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. No matter how much I tried to ignore it, the whole thing with my dad weighed on me. I hated that I still cared. I hated that part of me wanted him to call or show up at my door, apologizing for everything and asking me to come back. But that wasn't going to happen, and deep down, I knew it. Weeks turned into months, and eventually, I got into a routine. The diner job wasn't great, but it paid the bills, and I was managing to keep up with school. Kayla and I stayed close, and Ethan was still by my side. I was starting to feel like I had some control over my life again. But every now and then, when I was alone in that quiet apartment, I'd get this nagging feeling in the back of my mind. Like, what if I'd made a mistake? What if cutting off my dad wasn't the right move? I kept telling myself that I did what I had to do, that I couldn't stay in that toxic environment. And yeah, that was true. But still, it's not easy walking away from your family no matter how bad things get. There's always that little voice in your head wondering if there was another way, if maybe things could have been different. But I pushed those thoughts aside, focusing on the fact that I was finally in control of my own life. I didn't have to answer to anyone but myself, and that was a freedom I hadn't felt in years. And even though it was hard, I knew I'd made the right choice. So that's where I was, living in my tiny apartment, working long shifts, and trying to figure out what my next move was. I hadn't heard from my dad or Olivia since that text, and honestly, I was okay with that. I was starting to build something for myself, and that felt pretty damn good. All right, so things got messy after I left, but what really surprised me was how bad it got for them. I didn't expect their lives to fall apart like they did. It's almost like karma was just waiting for the right moment to come down hard on them. A few months after I had fully cut ties with my dad, Olivia, and Jess, I started hearing bits and pieces about what was going on with them. I wasn't trying to keep tabs on them or anything, but mutual friends and old neighbors would drop little tidbits in conversations. And from what I heard, their perfect life was slowly unraveling. It started small, arguments between my dad and Olivia, tensions at home. But eventually, things spiraled. Turns out, after I left, Jess really went off the rails. She wasn't just sulking over her unrequited crush on Ethan like she had been before. No, she fully spiraled. She dropped out of college not long after I moved out. At first, it seemed like she was just taking a break, but the truth was, she couldn't handle the pressure. Without Olivia constantly smoothing things over for her, Jess was left to deal with real life, and she couldn't do it. She started hanging out with the wrong crowd, getting into trouble. It got bad enough that Olivia, who once coddled Jess like she was made of glass, couldn't even control her anymore. And that's when things at home went from tense to chaotic. Olivia was freaking out because her perfect little girl was slipping through her fingers, and my dad? He was caught in the middle, trying to keep the peace like he always did. But this time it wasn't working. I heard that Jess ended up getting arrested. Twice. The first time was for shoplifting, and Olivia managed to get her out of it, pulling some strings with one of her lawyer friends. But the second time, it was worse. Apparently, Jess had been caught with some drugs at a party, and there was no quick fix for that. She was facing real charges, and Olivia couldn't just throw money at the problem to make it go away. From what I was told, this was the final straw for my dad. He had already been on edge dealing with Olivia's control issues and Jess's breakdown. But now, with legal problems and their reputations on the line, he snapped. They were constantly fighting. I mean, screaming matches, doors slamming, the works. And the thing is, Olivia had no one to blame but herself. She created this mess, but instead of admitting that, she tried to pin it on my dad, saying he wasn't supportive enough or that he wasn't leading the family. Classic deflection. Then there was the financial disaster. I found out through some old neighbors that my dad had made some bad investments after getting pressured by Olivia to expand their wealth. Olivia had always been obsessed with status, having the nicest house, the newest car, and of course being better than my mom ever was. She pushed my dad to invest in some sketchy real estate deal thinking they'd make a quick profit. Spoiler alert, it didn't work out. They lost a lot of money. Like, we're talking almost all of my dad's savings. The house they were living in, they were on the verge of losing it. Olivia had spent years pretending they were living the high life, and now it was all crumbling down around them. My dad, who had worked his whole life to build some kind of stability, was now facing the possibility of having nothing. And guess what? Olivia bailed. Yep, when things got too tough for her, she packed her bags and left. She wasn't about to stick around and deal with the consequences of the mess she helped create. From what I heard, she ran off with some guy who had more money, someone she met through one of her fancy social circles. It was typical Olivia, always chasing the next best thing, never sticking around when things got hard. So there was my dad, left with nothing. His wife had left him, his daughter was in serious legal trouble, and he was drowning in debt. I remember thinking, well, this is what happens when you pick the wrong side. And yeah, maybe that sounds harsh, but I couldn't feel bad for him. Not after everything he'd put me through. Then, out of nowhere, I got a text from my dad. It wasn't like the cold, business-like messages from before. This one had some desperation in it. He asked if we could talk. Said he needed to explain everything. I didn't respond right away. I mean, what was there to talk about? He chose Olivia and her perfect little life over me. And now that it was all falling apart, he wanted to reconnect? I wasn't interested in playing savior for him. But a week later, I got another text, and this one hit harder. He was asking for help. Financial help. Can you believe that? After everything that happened, he had the nerve to ask me for money. Said he was in a tough spot and that he didn't know where else to turn. I stared at that message for a long time, just trying to wrap my head around it. I guess that was his last play. Olivia was gone, Jess was a wreck, and now he was broke. The guy who had never really been there for me, who chose his new family over his own daughter, was asking for a lifeline. It was hard to believe, but at the same time, I wasn't shocked. When you build your life on someone else's terms, it falls apart just as easily. I didn't respond. I couldn't. There was nothing left to say. He made his choices, and now he had to live with them. It was kind of poetic in a way. The perfect little life he built around Olivia had crumbled, and now he was left standing in the ruins. Meanwhile, I was doing just fine. I had my own place, my own life, and I didn't need him anymore. That's the thing about karma. It doesn't care how long it takes. It just waits for the right moment to show up. And when it does, it doesn't hold back.